Chapter 1. The Golden Cage. Malcolm Sharp stood in the marble foyer of the Vance estate, watching his 4-year-old daughter Emma chase fireflies across the manicured lawn. The setting sun painted everything gold, but Malcolm felt only cold. 3 years ago, he'd been a different man. A Marine Corps captain with 2 tours in Afghanistan, Malcolm had built a successful security consulting firm from nothing. He was disciplined, strategic, and had learned to read people the way most people read books. Those skills had served him well in combat zones and boardrooms alike. Then he'd met Shelby Vance at a charity gala. She'd been stunning, elegant in a way that made other women look cheap by comparison. Blonde hair that fell in perfect waves, green eyes that sparkled with intelligence, a smile that could sell ice to Eskimos. She'd approached him directly, unusual for someone of her social standing. They'd talked for hours. She'd seemed genuinely interested in his work, his experiences, his thoughts on everything from foreign policy to classic literature. "You're different from the trust fund babies I usually meet," she told him that night. "You've actually done something with your life." They'd married within a year. Malcolm had thought he was the luckiest man alive. He'd been wrong. The Vance family made their fortune in pharmaceuticals. Taylor Vance had inherited Vance Industries from his father and grown it into a multi-billion-dollar empire. Jeannie Vance, née Livingston, came from old money herself. Together, they ruled Connecticut's elite social circles with iron fists wrapped in silk gloves. From the beginning, they'd made it clear Malcolm wasn't good enough for their daughter. He was new money at best, though in reality, he'd made his own way without any money at all. His father had been a high school teacher, his mother, a nurse. Good people, but not their kind of people. "Mother wants us to move into the East Wing," Shelby had announced 6 months into their marriage. "She's had it completely renovated. Custom everything." Malcolm had wanted to refuse, to maintain their independence in the modest but comfortable home he'd bought before they met. But Shelby was pregnant with Emma, and he'd convinced himself it was temporary. Just until the baby came. Just until they got on their feet. That was 3.5 years ago. Now, Malcolm's company was gone. Shelby had convinced him to bring Taylor on as an investor, and within 18 months, the Vances had systematically dismantled everything he'd built. Clients were poached. Contracts mysteriously fell through. Key employees were hired away with offers Malcolm couldn't match. When his company finally collapsed, Taylor had bought the remaining assets for pennies on the dollar. "Don't be dramatic, Malcolm," Shelby had said when he'd confronted her. "Daddy was just trying to help. You should be grateful he saved you from total bankruptcy." Malcolm had wanted to leave then. But Emma had just turned 3, and Shelby's lawyers had made it brutally clear. If he left, he'd never see his daughter again. The Vances had the money, the connections, the power to bury him in family court. He'd get supervised visitation at best, more likely nothing at all. So he'd stayed. And he'd watched. And he'd learned. The Vances weren't just wealthy, they were corrupt. Taylor's pharmaceutical company had made billions pushing opioids to desperate patients, falsifying research, bribing doctors and politicians. Malcolm had discovered this by accident, stumbling across documents Taylor had left in the study one night. He'd started investigating quietly, carefully, knowing he'd need evidence if he ever wanted to escape this golden cage. "Daddy, look," Emma's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She held up a firefly cupped in her small hands, her face glowing with innocent joy. Malcolm crossed the lawn and knelt beside her. "Beautiful, sweetheart. Now let it go so it can find its family." Emma opened her hands, and the firefly drifted away into the dusk. "Like a wish," she whispered. "Exactly like a wish." Malcolm pulled her close, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo. She was the only pure thing in this poisoned paradise. "Malcolm," Jeannie Vance's voice cut across the lawn like a whip crack. She stood on the terrace, impeccably dressed in a cream suit despite the late hour. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face, pulled tight by expensive surgery, wore its usual expression of disdain. "We're having dinner in 30 minutes. Do try to make yourself presentable, and get Emma cleaned up. She looks like a vagrant." Malcolm felt Emma tense against him. She was only 4, but she already knew to fear her grandmother. "We'll be there," Malcolm called back, keeping his voice neutral. As Jeannie disappeared back inside, Emma looked up at him. "Daddy, why doesn't Grandma like us? Some people don't know how to love, baby girl. That's their problem, not ours." But as he led Emma back toward the house, Malcolm's jaw tightened. He'd spent 3 years gathering evidence, building his case, planning his exit strategy. The documents he'd compiled would send Taylor to prison for the rest of his life. Jeannie, too, as she'd been complicit in every decision. And Shelby, his wife, had revealed herself slowly, like a photograph developing in chemicals. The warm, intelligent woman he'd married had been a performance. The real Shelby was her mother's daughter, cold, entitled, and cruel. She'd married Malcolm because she'd been bored and he'd been a novelty. Now that the novelty had worn off, she treated him with open contempt. 3 weeks ago, he'd overheard a conversation that changed everything. He'd been in the library, reviewing documents on his laptop, when voices had drifted through the heating vent from Taylor's study directly above. Malcolm had closed his laptop and listened. "We need to resolve the Malcolm situation." That was Taylor's voice. "I'm working on it, Daddy." Shelby sounded petulant, like a child being scolded. "He won't agree to a divorce. Because he knows he'll lose Emma. Jeannie this time. We should have dealt with this before the child was born." "The prenup protects our assets," Taylor said. "But he's becoming a liability. He's too smart. He asks too many questions." "So what do you suggest?" Shelby asked. There was a long pause. Then Jeannie spoke, her voice cold enough to freeze blood. "An accident. Something clean. He has that dangerous job, or he did. Security consulting takes people to risky places." "Mother, don't be naive, dear. Do you think this is the first time we've had to solve a problem like this? Your father and I have been protecting this family for 40 years. Malcolm Sharp is a problem. Problems get solved." Malcolm had sat frozen in the library, his heart pounding. They weren't just talking about divorce. They were talking about murder. "What about Emma?" Shelby's voice had wavered. "She loves him. She's 4, Jeannie said dismissively. "She'll forget. Children are resilient. In a year, she won't even remember him." That night, Malcolm had started planning in earnest. He'd activated old military contacts, moved money into accounts the Van Cess didn't know about, and begun preparing for war. Because that's what this was, war. And Malcolm Sharp had fought wars before. He decided to take one last piece of evidence. Proof that Taylor's company had falsified clinical trials for their newest opioid, a drug that was killing hundreds of people. Malcolm had seen the emails, the research data, the payoffs to FDA officials. But he needed the physical documents from Taylor's safe. And tonight, Taylor had given him the perfect opportunity. "Malcolm," Taylor's voice boomed from the study as Malcolm helped Emma wash her hands in the powder room. "A word, if you don't mind." Malcolm dried Emma's hands and sent her to find her nanny. Then he walked to the study, every sense alert. Taylor sat behind his massive desk, a glass of scotch in his hand. He was a big man, running to fat in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and the ruddy complexion of someone who drank too much. But his eyes were sharp and calculating. "Close the door," Taylor said. Malcolm did, noting the position of the security cameras. They covered most of the room, but there was a blind spot near the bookshelves. He discovered it months ago. "I have a proposition for you," Taylor began. "I know things have been difficult. You've made sacrifices for this family, and I appreciate that. So I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer. I'm listening. Next week, we're flying to our place in Aspen for a family vacation. Just the 5 of us. Me, Jeannie, Shelby, you, and Emma. Quality time, away from all this." He gestured vaguely at the world beyond his study. "While we're there, I'd like to discuss your future with the company. I'm thinking of creating a position for you. Vice President of Special Operations. Salary, benefits, the works. All you'd need to do is sign a few documents." Malcolm kept his face neutral, but his mind was racing. This was it, the trap. Get him on the private plane, isolated in Aspen, have him sign documents that would either incriminate him or sign away his parental rights. And if he refused? An accident. Something clean. "That's very generous," Malcolm said carefully. "Can I think about it?" Of course. We leave Tuesday morning. Let me know by tomorrow." Taylor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I really do hope you'll accept, Malcolm. It would be unfortunate if you didn't." The threat was barely veiled. Malcolm nodded and left the study. His mind was already working through scenarios, contingencies, counters to their moves. He'd spent 3 years being underestimated by these people. They thought he was broken, neutered, trapped. They were about to learn how wrong they were. That night, after Emma was asleep, Malcolm sat in the darkness of their bedroom suite and finalized his plan. He'd worn a wire to dinner, recorded Taylor's offer with all its implications. He'd already copied the contents of Taylor's safe using a security exploit the old man didn't know existed. He had evidence, he had contacts, and he had training they couldn't imagine. But most importantly, he had something they'd never understand: love for his daughter that transcended wealth, status, or self-preservation. Malcolm Sharp was going to war, and he was going to win. Chapter 2. The Trap Closes. The next 3 days passed in a carefully choreographed dance. Malcolm played the part of the defeated son-in-law, accepting Taylor's offer with appropriate gratitude. He packed for Aspen, helped Emma choose her favorite toys, and smiled through family dinners where the Van Cess discussed their upcoming trip with barely concealed anticipation. But behind the facade, Malcolm was preparing. His old Marine buddy, Chris Wilkinson, now worked for the FBI's white-collar crime division. Malcolm had been feeding Chris information about Vance Industries for months, building a case that would be airtight. 3 days before the Aspen trip, he'd met Chris at a diner 40 miles from the estate. "This is everything," Malcolm had said, sliding an encrypted drive across the table. Financial records, falsified research data, communications with FDA officials, bribery documentation, and proof they've been covering up hundreds of deaths related to Vance Payne. It's all there. Chris had pocketed the drive, his expression grim. "This is enough to bring down the whole company. But Malcolm, if they suspect you're the source." "They already want me dead," Malcolm had said flatly. He'd explained the conversation he'd overheard, Taylor's suspicious job offer, and the planned trip to Aspen. "I need you to be ready. When I signal, I need federal agents waiting." "What are you planning?" "I'm going to give them enough rope to hang themselves. But I need to know Emma will be safe." Chris had nodded slowly. "I'll have a team ready. But Malcolm, this is dangerous. If they try something before, I'll be ready." Malcolm had stood to leave, then paused. "If something goes wrong, if I don't make it, make sure Emma knows I loved her. And make sure they pay for every life they've destroyed." Now, standing in the pre-dawn darkness outside the Vance estate, Malcolm watched the family's private jet being prepared for departure. It was a Gulfstream G650, worth $70 million, one of Taylor's many toys. Malcolm had spent the last 2 days studying every detail of the aircraft, its safety systems, its emergency equipment. He'd also planted insurance. "Daddy." Emma ran out of the house, her small backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She wore her favorite purple dress and light-up sneakers. "Are we really flying in Grandpa's plane?" "We sure are, sweetheart." Malcolm lifted her into his arms, hugging her tight. He'd packed a small bag for her that included a GPS tracker, a prepaid phone, and a sealed letter explaining everything. Insurance in case his plan failed. Shelby emerged from the house, perfectly dressed in designer travel wear. She barely glanced at Malcolm as she walked past, heading for the waiting car that would take them to the private airfield. There was no warmth in her eyes, no acknowledgement that they'd once promised to love each other forever. She'd made her choice. She'd chosen her family's money and power over everything else. "Is Mommy mad?" Emma whispered. "Mommy's just focused on the trip," Malcolm said, though his daughter's intuition was accurate. At 4, Emma was already learning to read the emotional temperature of rooms, to sense danger in the tension of adult bodies. Malcolm hated that she had to learn these lessons so young. The drive to the airfield took 20 minutes. Taylor and Jeannie rode in their own car, maintaining the pretense of family harmony while staying separate from the man they planned to eliminate. Malcolm used the time to review his plan once more. The jet would reach cruising altitude, around 30,000 feet, about 40 minutes into the flight. That's when they'd make their move. He'd seen the documents Taylor had prepared, accidentally on purpose left where Malcolm would find them. Papers that would sign away his parental rights, documents claiming he was mentally unstable, forms that would grant the Van Cess full custody of Emma. They'd threaten him, corner him, break him down psychologically. And if he still refused to sign, an accident, something clean. But Malcolm had plans of his own. On the tarmac, the pilot, Hal Ward, who'd been with the Vance family for 15 years, greeted them with professional courtesy. Malcolm had researched Ward thoroughly. The pilot was loyal to the Van Cess, well compensated for his discretion. He'd look the other way if needed. The interior of the Gulfstream was opulent, cream leather seats, polished wood paneling, a full bar, and a bedroom suite in the rear. Emma's eyes went wide with wonder. It's like a flying castle, she breathed. Sure is, baby girl. Malcolm helped her buckle into one of the seats, then took his own place across from her. Shelby sat as far away as possible, scrolling through her phone with studied indifference. Taylor and Jeannie sat together near the front, speaking in low voices. The engine spooled up. The jet began to taxi. Malcolm's heart rate remained steady, a skill learned in combat. Fear was natural, but panic was the enemy. He needed to stay calm, stay sharp, stay ready. They took off smoothly, climbing into the clear morning sky. Emma pressed her face to the window, watching the ground fall away. Look, Daddy. Everything looks like toys. That's right, sweetheart. Malcolm checked his watch. 40 minutes until they reached cruising altitude. 40 minutes until hell broke loose. He'd prepared for this. Hidden in his carry-on was a small camera, already recording. Sewn into his jacket was a second GPS tracker. And most importantly, he'd sent a message to Chris Wilkinson before leaving the estate. A simple code that meant the game was in motion. 30 minutes into the flight, Taylor unbuckled and walked back to where Malcolm sat. His expression was affable, but his eyes were cold. Why don't you join me in the bedroom suite? Taylor said. We can discuss those documents I mentioned. Give you time to review them properly. It wasn't a request. Malcolm glanced at Emma, who was now playing with her tablet, headphones on. Will this take long? As long as it needs to, Taylor said. Malcolm stood and followed Taylor toward the rear of the plane. As they passed Shelby, she looked up from her phone, and Malcolm saw something flash in her eyes. Was it guilt? Fear? It was gone before he could analyze it. The bedroom suite was compact but luxurious. Taylor closed the door and pulled a folder from a cabinet. Let's cut the bullshit, Malcolm. You're going to sign these papers. All of them. Malcolm took the folder and flipped through it. Exactly what he'd expected. Documents declaring him an unfit parent. Papers granting full custody to Shelby. And, this was new, a confession stating he'd embezzled funds from his own company before it collapsed. I'm not signing these, Malcolm said calmly. Taylor's jaw tightened. You don't have a choice. Everyone has choices. Not you. Not anymore. Taylor's voice dropped to a menacing growl. You're going to sign those papers, Malcolm. Or you're going to have a very unfortunate accident. Maybe you'll try to open the door at altitude. Maybe you'll fall. These things happen. Malcolm let the silence stretch. Then he smiled, a cold, calculating expression that made Taylor take a half step back. You're threatening to murder me, Malcolm said quietly. And you think I didn't see this coming? I think you're a bug I'm about to squash, Taylor snarled. You never belonged in this family. Shelby made a mistake, but we're correcting it. Now sign the goddamn papers, or... The door burst open. Jeannie stood there, her face twisted with fury. Enough talking. He's not going to sign. I knew he wouldn't. Weak men always choose pride over sense. Behind her, Shelby appeared. And behind Shelby, Emma. Malcolm's blood ran cold. Emma, go back to your seat. She needs to see this, Jeannie said coldly. She needs to understand what happens to people who defy this family. You're insane, Malcolm said, moving toward his daughter. But Shelby grabbed Emma's hand, holding her back. Don't, Shelby said. Her voice shook slightly. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Malcolm. Just sign the papers. You can disappear. Start over somewhere. We'll give you money. And Emma stays with me. With us. Where she belongs. Malcolm looked at his wife, his ex-wife in all but legal terms, and saw the woman she'd become. Or maybe she'd always been this person, and he'd been too blind to see it. No, he said simply. Jeannie's face hardened. Then you've made your choice. Taylor, get the pilot to unlock the door mechanism. Malcolm's mind raced. They were going to do it. Actually throw him off the plane. The insanity of it was almost breathtaking. They'd gotten away with so much for so long that they truly believed they were untouchable. Taylor moved toward the cockpit, but Malcolm was faster. Years of combat training took over. He grabbed Taylor's arm, twisted, and had the older man in a control hold before anyone could react. Don't move, Malcolm said quietly. Any of you. Let him go, Jeannie shrieked. Emma, come here. Now. Malcolm kept his voice calm, authoritative. His daughter hesitated, then pulled free of Shelby's grip and ran to him. He released Taylor and swept Emma into his arms, backing toward the cockpit. You're making this worse, Shelby said. But there was panic in her eyes now. Their plan was falling apart. I'm ending this, Malcolm said. He reached the cockpit door and pounded on it. Ward, open up. Federal emergency. The pilot's voice came through the intercom. Sir, I can't do that without Mr. Vance's. Malcolm didn't wait. He'd studied the aircraft systems. He knew the emergency override code. He punched it into the keypad, and the door clicked open. Hal Ward turned in his seat, confused and alarmed. What the hell? FBI, Malcolm said, pulling out his phone and showing the badge Chris had given him, a temporary credential that would hold up under scrutiny. This flight is under federal investigation. You're going to turn this plane around now. Ward's eyes widened. Behind Malcolm, he heard Jeannie's scream of rage, heard Taylor shouting threats. But Malcolm had what he needed, time and leverage. Do it, he told Ward, or you'll be charged as an accessory to attempted murder. The pilot's hands trembled as he reached for the controls. That's when Shelby made her move. Chapter 3, 30,000 feet. Shelby lunged forward, trying to grab Emma from Malcolm's arms. But Malcolm had anticipated this, anticipated everything. He twisted away, shielding his daughter with his body. You can't do this. Shelby screamed. She's my daughter. She's our daughter, Malcolm shot back. And I'm saving her from you people. Emma was crying now, terrified and confused. Malcolm hated this, hated that she had to witness this ugliness. But there was no other way. Ward, turn the plane around, Malcolm repeated. Now. The pilot looked past Malcolm to where Taylor stood, clearly torn between two authorities. Taylor's face was purple with rage. If you listen to him, you're fired, Taylor snarled. And I'll make sure you never work again. If you don't listen to me, you're an accomplice to kidnapping and attempted murder, Malcolm countered. Federal charges. Federal prison. Choose wisely. Hal Ward's training won out over his loyalty. He began turning the aircraft. That's when Jeannie pulled out a gun. Malcolm froze. He'd anticipated many things, but not this. The small pistol looked almost toy-like in her manicured hands, but it was very real. You stupid, arrogant little man, Jeannie said, her voice dripping with venom. Did you really think you could outsmart us? We've been doing this since before you were born. We've crushed bigger obstacles than you. Put the gun down, Malcolm said carefully. He shifted Emma behind him, using his body as a shield. You're not going to shoot. Not in a pressurized cabin. She doesn't need to shoot you, Taylor said, his confidence returning. She just needs you to understand we're serious. Now give us Emma and sign the goddamn papers. Malcolm's mind was racing through scenarios. The gun changed everything. He couldn't rush Jeannie, not with Emma here. He couldn't call her bluff because he wasn't sure it was a bluff. These people had already proven they were capable of murder. Think about what you're doing, Malcolm said. Even if you succeed, you won't get away with it. I've already contacted the FBI. They know everything. All your crimes, all your corruption. It's over. You're lying, Shelby said, but there was doubt in her voice. Am I? How do you think I found out about the falsified clinical trials? The bribed FDA officials? The deaths you've covered up? Malcolm met Taylor's eyes. I've spent 3 years documenting everything. Chris Wilkinson at the FBI has enough evidence to put all of you away for life. Even if I don't walk off this plane, you're finished. Jeannie's hand trembled slightly. The gun wavered. He's bluffing, Taylor said, but he sounded less certain. Check your phone, Malcolm suggested. Check your email. I sent you something this morning. Insurance. Taylor pulled out his phone, scrolled, and his face went pale. Malcolm had sent him a file list, just the names of documents, nothing more. But it was enough. Taylor could see exactly what Malcolm had taken. You son of a bitch, Taylor whispered. I learned from the best, Malcolm said. You people taught me how to be ruthless, how to plan, how to protect what matters. He held Emma tighter, and she matters more than anything. For a long moment, no one moved. The plane's engines hummed. Somewhere behind them, the co-pilot was probably trying to figure out what the hell was happening. Then Jeannie smiled, a terrifying, cold expression. You know what? You're right. This has gotten out of hand. Let's all just calm down and talk reasonably. Malcolm didn't believe her for a second, but he nodded carefully. Good. Put the gun away and Jeannie fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Malcolm felt the bullet graze his shoulder, a burning line of pain. He'd moved at the last second, pure instinct saving his life. But the shot had another effect. Alarms started blaring. The sudden decompression warning. You crazy bitch. Hal Ward shouted from the cockpit. You've breached the hull. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. The plane began to shake. Ward was fighting the controls, trying to descend to a safer altitude where they could breathe without supplemental oxygen. In the chaos, Malcolm made his move. He grabbed an oxygen mask, put it over Emma's face, then rushed past the Van Cess toward the back of the plane. There was an emergency exit there. He'd studied the schematics obsessively, and attached to it was an emergency evacuation slide. "Stop him," Taylor roared. But Malcolm was already at the door. He punched the emergency release. Warning lights flashed. The aircraft's systems were screaming alerts. "Daddy, what are you doing?" Emma cried through the oxygen mask. "Trust me, baby girl. I need you to trust me." Malcolm pulled her close, securing her against his chest with one arm. With his other hand, he grabbed the emergency slide handle. Shelby was running toward them, her face twisted with fury and fear. "You're insane. You'll kill her. Better than leaving her with you," Malcolm said. And then he made a decision that would haunt him and save him in equal measure. He hit the emergency slide deployment button. The door didn't fully open, not at this altitude, not with the pressure differential. But the slide began to inflate, filling the rear section of the plane with the yellow rubber escape chute. It was chaos. The wind, the noise, the alarms, Emma's screaming. Malcolm pulled a parachute harness from the emergency equipment locker, something he'd verified was there during his research. It was designed for crew in case of bailout scenarios. He strapped Emma to his chest, securing her with every buckle and strap he could find. "No!" Jeannie's scream cut through everything. She was pointing the gun again, trying to aim through the chaos. But Hal Ward had gotten the plane under control, descending rapidly. The pressure was equalizing. And the slide. Malcolm realized what he had. An insane, desperate, probably suicidal option. The slide extended out of the partially open door. It wasn't meant to be used this way. It was meant for ground evacuations. But it was inflated, it was there, and it was his only chance. "I love you, Emma," Malcolm whispered into his daughter's hair. "I love you so much." Then he jumped. Not out of the plane, they were still too high for that, but onto the slide. He and Emma hit the inflated rubber and began sliding, the material stretching and compressing under their weight. The wind was incredible, tearing at them, trying to rip them apart. But Malcolm held on. He'd trained for hostile environments, for situations where failure meant death. He wrapped himself around Emma, protecting her with every ounce of his strength. The slide, still attached to the plane by its tether system, stretched out behind the descending aircraft like a bizarre yellow tail. They slid down its length, the material burning Malcolm's back even through his jacket. "Daddy!" Emma's voice was lost in the wind. Malcolm could see them in the doorway, Taylor, Jeannie, Shelby, staring in shock and horror. Jeannie raised the gun one more time, but the wind made aiming impossible. The plane continued to descend. 15,000 feet. 10,000 feet. The slide stretched further, the forces incredible. And then, as they reached 8,000 feet, the slide's attachment point gave way. They were falling. But they were falling with an inflated emergency slide wrapped around them like the world's strangest parachute. The rubber material billowed and caught air, slowing their descent. It wasn't a real parachute. The landing was going to be hard, possibly fatal. But it was a chance. Malcolm saw the ground rushing up. They were over rural Connecticut, farmland and forests. He steered the slide as best he could toward a wooded area, hoping the trees would break their fall. "Close your eyes, baby," he shouted to Emma. "Close your eyes and hold on to Daddy." They hit the tree line with tremendous force. Branches snapped and cracked. The slide tore and deflated. Malcolm felt ribs break, felt pain explode through his body. But he kept his grip on Emma, kept his body between her and the impact. They crashed through the canopy and hit the ground hard enough to knock the air from Malcolm's lungs. For a moment, everything went dark. Then, slowly, consciousness returned. Malcolm was lying on his back in a forest clearing, the tattered remains of the emergency slide draped over them like a yellow shroud. Every part of his body screamed in agony. But Emma was moving against his chest, crying but alive. "Daddy! Daddy, wake up!" "I'm here, baby girl," Malcolm managed. He unstrapped her with shaking hands, checking her over for injuries. Bruises, definitely. Maybe a sprained wrist. But alive. Miraculously, impossibly alive. They'd survived a fall from an aircraft. Not the 30,000 feet Jeannie had threatened, but still high enough that survival should have been impossible. Malcolm pulled out his phone, cracked screen, but still functional. He had signal. He dialed Chris Wilkinson's number. "Chris, it's Malcolm. We're alive. Track my GPS and send everyone. The Vances just tried to murder me and my daughter. I have it all recorded. Everything. Jesus Christ, Malcolm. I'm tracking you now. Where? Just hurry. And Chris, make sure they don't land that plane. Arrest them the second they touch down. All of them." Malcolm ended the call and pulled Emma close. They sat there in the forest, waiting for rescue, while overhead, the Vance family's private jet continued toward whatever destination they planned, not knowing that their world was about to end. Malcolm allowed himself a grim smile. He'd told them he was going to war. Now they were going to learn what happened when you went to war with a Marine. Chapter 4. The Reckoning Begins. 6 hours later, Malcolm sat in a Connecticut State Police barracks, his ribs taped and his shoulder bandaged, watching through one-way glass as federal agents arrested Taylor Vance on the tarmac of Hartford Brainerd Airport. Emma slept in the next room, under the watchful eye of a victim advocate. The doctors had examined her thoroughly. Minor bruises, nothing more. The emergency harness Malcolm had strapped her into had saved her life, along with his body shielding her through the fall. They were calling it a miracle. Malcolm called it preparation meeting opportunity. "That was the single most insane thing I've ever witnessed," Chris Wilkinson said, standing beside Malcolm. The FBI agent looked like he'd aged 5 years in the last 6 hours. "When you said you'd give them rope to hang themselves, I didn't think you meant literally jumping off a plane." "The slide was rated for that altitude," Malcolm said. Technically, you should both be dead. But we're not." Malcolm watched as federal agents led Taylor toward a waiting van, the pharmaceutical magnate's face purple with rage and disbelief. "And now they're finished." Chris pulled out a tablet and swiped through documents. "We've frozen all Vance Industries accounts. Seized their properties. The evidence you provided. Malcolm, this is massive. We're talking about one of the biggest pharmaceutical fraud cases in U.S. history. The falsified trials, the bribery, the covered-up deaths. There are at least 300 fatalities directly linked to Vance Payne that they knew about and buried." 317, Malcolm said quietly. "I counted. 317 people who'd taken Vance Payne for legitimate pain management and ended up addicted or dead. People with names, families, lives. All sacrificed to the Vances greed." "What about Shelby?" Malcolm asked. Chris's expression grew complicated. "She's claiming she didn't know about the fraud. Says she was just as much a victim as you were." Malcolm laughed bitterly. "She knew. She was on the board of directors. She signed off on the falsified reports." "Can you prove it?" "Yes." Malcolm pulled out his own phone, the one he'd kept hidden from the Vances, the one with all his backup recordings and documents. "I recorded board meetings. She was there. She voted yes on covering up the clinical trial problems. It's all here." Chris took the phone, scrolling through files. His expression grew darker with each passing moment. "This is... Jesus, Malcolm. You've been recording for 3 years. I learned in the Marines, document everything. Assume everyone's lying. Trust, but verify." Malcolm's voice was flat, emotionless. He was too tired for emotion, too wrung out. "I knew they'd try something eventually. I just didn't think they'd actually try to throw me off a plane." "About that." Chris pulled up another file. The Cockpit voice recorder captured everything. Taylor's threats, Jeannie firing the gun, your entire exchange. "We have them on attempted murder, kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon. And that's before we even get to the fraud charges." "What about Howard?" "The pilot's cooperating. Says he had no idea what was planned, that Taylor ordered him to unlock certain safety protocols before the flight, but claimed it was for maintenance reasons. He's providing testimony about other suspicious flights, times when Taylor had him fly to unusual locations with no flight plan logged." Malcolm filed that information away. More crimes, more evidence. The Vances empire was crumbling in real time. "There's something else," Chris said carefully. "Jeannie Vance is asking to make a deal." Malcolm's head snapped up. "What kind of deal?" "Full cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. She's claiming Taylor masterminded everything, that she was coerced, that she feared for her life. She's willing to testify against him." "That's bullshit. She was the one who pulled the trigger. She was the one who suggested killing me in the first place." Malcolm's hands clenched into fists. "I heard her say it. An accident. Something clean." Those were her exact words. "We have that recording too," Chris assured him. But she's a wealthy white woman in her 60s with expensive lawyers. Juries sometimes. No deals. Malcolm's voice was hard as iron. Not for her, not for Taylor, not for Shelby. They all pay for what they did. Every single one of them. Chris studied him for a long moment. You've changed, Malcolm. You're harder than when we served together. They made me harder. Malcolm stood, wincing as his ribs protested. I gave them 3 years of my life. 3 years of watching them destroy people without consequence. 3 years of being told I wasn't good enough, that I didn't matter, that I was disposable. He turned to face his old friend. I'm done being disposable. And I'm done letting people like them walk away. A knock on the door interrupted them. Another FBI agent entered, a woman with sharp features and an efficient demeanor. Agent Wilkinson? Shelby Vance's lawyers are here. They want to negotiate custody arrangements for Emma Sharp. Malcolm's blood ran cold. No. Malcolm, Chris began. No. She tried to kill me. She stood there and watched while her mother shot at me. She held Emma while they threatened to throw us both off a plane. Malcolm's voice rose. She doesn't get custody. She doesn't get visitation. She doesn't get anything except a prison cell. The female agent looked uncomfortable. Mr. Sharp, family court is separate from criminal court. Even if Mrs. Vance is convicted of criminal charges, she might still have parental rights. Then I'll bury her in litigation until Emma's 18. Malcolm was shaking now, adrenaline and fury warring with exhaustion. I'll use every penny I have, every favor I'm owed, every bit of evidence I've gathered. Shelby Vance is never going near my daughter again. Chris put a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. Okay, we'll handle it. But you need to calm down. You need to rest. You've got broken ribs, a concussion, and you've been through hell. I'll rest when they're all in prison. That could take months, Malcolm. Years, maybe. Then I've got time. Chris exchanged a look with the female agent, then nodded. All right. We'll tell Shelby's lawyers no negotiations on custody. Everything goes through criminal proceedings first. But Malcolm, you need to think about Emma. She's been through trauma too. She needs stability, therapy, time to process. Malcolm's anger drained away, replaced by a wave of exhaustion so profound he could barely stand. You're right. I can't lose her, Chris. She's all I have left. You won't lose her. I promise you that. Chris guided Malcolm back to the chair. Now sit down before you fall down. I'll have someone bring coffee and food. You need to keep your strength up. As Chris left to deal with Shelby's lawyers, Malcolm sat alone in the observation room, watching through the glass as more federal agents processed the crime scene. They'd grounded the Vance plane, were photographing the damaged door, collecting evidence from the cockpit voice recorder. Malcolm's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You think you've won. You haven't. My family has survived worse than you. We'll bury you in court. We'll take Emma. And you'll die broke and alone. It had to be from Shelby, using a burner phone. Malcolm stared at the message for a long moment, then took a screenshot and forwarded it to Chris. More evidence of harassment, of threats, of the Vances' unwillingness to accept that their reign of terror was over. Then he typed a reply. I already died. On that plane, when you chose your parents over our daughter, I died. The man who loved you, who believed in you, who thought we were building something real, he's gone. What's left is someone who learned from the best how to destroy enemies. And you're my enemy now, Shelby. All of you are. So bring your lawyers, bring your money, bring everything you've got. I'm ready for war. He hit send, then blocked the number. Malcolm leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes. His body ached. His heart ached worse. But underneath the pain, underneath the exhaustion, there was something solid and unwavering, determination. The Vances had made a fundamental mistake. They'd assumed Malcolm was weak because he'd loved them, because he'd tried to make the marriage work, because he'd endured their contempt for Emma's sake. But love wasn't weakness. Love was the reason he'd spent 3 years gathering evidence. Love was the reason he'd studied emergency protocols and aircraft systems. Love was the reason he'd survived an impossible fall and kept his daughter safe. The Vances didn't understand love. They understood money, power, manipulation. But they'd never understood that someone who truly loved would burn down the world to protect what mattered. Malcolm Sharp was about to teach them that lesson, and it was going to cost them everything. Chapter 5, The Media Storm. By the next morning, the story had exploded across every news outlet in the country. Pharmaceutical heir arrested in mid-flight murder plot, screamed the headline on CNN. Billionaire family's reign of terror exposed, declared the New York Times. Father saves daughter in dramatic plane escape, read USA Today. Malcolm watched the coverage from a safe house the FBI had arranged, a modest apartment in a secure building where he and Emma could stay while the investigation unfolded. Emma was in the bedroom, playing with toys Chris had brought, blissfully unaware of the media frenzy swirling around them. "You're a hero," Chris said, standing beside Malcolm as they watched a cable news anchor interview an aviation expert about the survival odds of their escape. The stories everywhere. Former Marine, self-made businessman, took down a corrupt billionaire family. Social media is going crazy. "I'm not a hero," Malcolm said. "I'm just a father who refused to die." Well, the public disagrees. Chris pulled up his laptop, showing Malcolm the trending hashtags. Hashtag Justice for Malcolm. Hashtag Take Down the Van Cess. Hashtag Father of the Year. Your story's resonating. People are sick of wealthy criminals getting away with everything. You're becoming a symbol. Malcolm scrolled through the posts. Thousands of people sharing their own stories of being crushed by powerful families, of losing loved ones to pharmaceutical companies' greed, of David versus Goliath battles that usually ended with David dead and Goliath richer. But there were other posts too. Criticism. Questions. Conspiracy theories. Something doesn't add up. How did he survive that fall? Sounds like a publicity stunt. Nobody's that lucky. Probably lying about the whole thing. The Van Cess are good people. I worked for them for years. Malcolm pointed to that last one. They're going to try to paint me as the villain. They've got money, connections, PR firms. Let them try, Chris said. We've got evidence. Recordings. Physical proof. The plane's voice recorder alone is enough to convict them 20 times over. And the fraud case is ironclad. 317 deaths, Malcolm. The families are already organizing, filing wrongful death suits. The Van Cess are going to be drowning in litigation for the rest of their lives. A knock at the door made them both tense. Chris checked the security camera feed, then relaxed. It's the prosecutor, Linda Buchanan. She's good, tough as nails, doesn't lose cases. Linda Buchanan was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades putting criminals behind bars. She shook Malcolm's hand with a firm grip. "Mr. Sharp, I've reviewed your evidence. It's impressive, comprehensive, almost obsessive. I had 3 years," Malcolm said. "And you used them well." She sat down, pulling out her own tablet. "I'm prosecuting the fraud case personally. Federal charges, conspiracy to defraud the FDA, falsification of clinical trial data, bribery of federal officials, and approximately 300 counts of negligent homicide related to Vance Payne deaths. Taylor and Jeannie Vance will likely die in prison. Shelby Vance will serve significant time as well." "What about the attempted murder charges?" Malcolm asked. "That's being handled by the Connecticut State Attorney's Office. They have the plane recordings, your testimony, Emma's testimony, though we'll try to minimize her involvement, and physical evidence from the aircraft. It's another slam dunk case." "Shelby's lawyers are going to argue she was coerced," Chris said. "That she feared her parents, that she didn't actually participate in the assault." Linda's smile was cold. "Then we'll play the recording where she laughs and tells you to fall like the trash you are. Hard to claim you were coerced when you're actively participating." Malcolm felt a grim satisfaction. He'd caught that moment on his hidden recording device, Shelby's mask slipping completely, revealing the cruelty underneath. It was the evidence that would destroy any sympathy jury might have for her. "What's the timeline?" Malcolm asked. "Grand jury convenes next week for the fraud charges. The attempted murder case will take longer, probably 3 to 6 months before trial. In the meantime, I need you to be careful. The Van Cess still have allies, people who owe them favors, employees who don't want to see their paycheck source disappear." "Are you saying I'm in danger?" "I'm saying wealthy people facing life in prison sometimes do desperate things. You're the key witness in multiple cases. If something happened to you, the evidence still exists," Malcolm said. "I made sure of that. Multiple copies, multiple locations, dead man switches. If I die, everything goes public automatically." Linda and Chris exchanged impressed looks. "You really did think of everything," Linda said. "I'm a paranoid bastard," Malcolm replied. "The Marines taught me to plan for worst-case scenarios. The Van Cess taught me that worst-case scenarios actually happen. Well, your paranoia might save your life." Linda stood to leave. I'll be in touch. In the meantime, stay in the safe house. Don't talk to media without clearing it through me first, and keep your daughter close. The Van Cess lawyers are going to try everything to discredit you. They'll dig into your past, look for anything they can twist or use against you. Be ready for it. After she left, Malcolm sat in silence, processing. He'd known intellectually that destroying the Van Cess would be a long, difficult process. But actually living through it, dealing with lawyers and prosecutors and media scrutiny, it was exhausting. Daddy. Emma appeared in the doorway, holding a stuffed bear Chris had brought. Can we go home? Malcolm's heart broke a little. Home. They didn't have a home anymore. The Vance estate was a crime scene. His old house had been sold years ago. Everything they'd built was gone. Not yet, sweetheart, he said gently. But we'll find a new home. Just you and me. Somewhere safe and happy. Without Mommy. The question hung in the air. Malcolm had been dreading this conversation. How do you explain to a 4-year-old that her mother tried to kill her father? That her grandparents were monsters? That the family she'd known was built on lies and corruption? Mommy made some bad choices, Malcolm said carefully. Really bad choices. She hurt people. So she has to go away for a while. Did she hurt you? Yes, baby. She did. Emma thought about this, her small face serious beyond her years. Then she climbed into Malcolm's lap, careful of his bandaged ribs, and hugged him tight. I'm glad you didn't die, Daddy. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. They sat like that for a long time, father and daughter, survivors of a war that most people couldn't imagine. Outside, the world was watching their story unfold. Inside, they were just two people trying to figure out how to move forward. Malcolm's phone buzzed. Another text, this time from a number he recognized. Maurice Livingston, one of his old employees from the security firm. They'd stayed in occasional contact after the company collapsed. Malcolm, I saw the news. I'm so sorry about everything. If you need anything, testimony, character witness, whatever, I'm here. You were a good boss. The best I ever had. Those bastards destroyed something real, and I'll help you make them pay. Malcolm read the message twice, feeling something warm kindle in his chest. Not everyone had abandoned him when the Van Cess destroyed his company. Some people remembered. Some people still believed in him. He typed back, Thanks, Maurice. I might take you up on that. And I'm planning to rebuild the company once this is over. If you're interested in coming back. The response came immediately. Hell yes. Let me know when you're ready. I'll spread the word to the old team. Malcolm smiled, his first genuine smile in days. The Van Cess had taken his company, but they hadn't taken his reputation, his relationships, his ability to rebuild. He'd started from nothing once before. He could do it again. But first, he had to finish what he started. He pulled up his encrypted files, the ones containing everything he knew about the Van Cess. The fraud was just the beginning. There were other crimes, other secrets he'd uncovered. Offshore accounts, money laundering, connections to politicians who'd looked the other way while Vance Payne killed people. Malcolm had built a nuclear bomb of evidence. He'd been planning to turn it all over to authorities. But now, watching the media coverage, seeing how the Van Cess lawyers were already spinning the story, trying to create doubt. Maybe it was time to be more strategic. Time to deploy his evidence piece by piece, keeping the pressure constant, never giving them time to recover or rebuild their narrative. The Van Cess thought this was a trial. They thought they could lawyer their way out, buy their way out, influence their way out. Malcolm was going to teach them that some wars weren't won in courtrooms. Some wars were won by destroying your enemy's ability to fight back. And he'd learned from masters how to do exactly that. Chapter 6. Allies and Enemies. 2 weeks later, Malcolm stood in a Connecticut courthouse, watching as a grand jury handed down indictments against the entire Vance family. The charges were extensive: conspiracy, fraud, negligent homicide, attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon. The bail hearing alone took 4 hours. Taylor Vance's lawyers argued he was a pillar of the community, not a flight risk, deserving of bail. The prosecutor, Linda Buchanan, played the Cockpit voice recording where Taylor explicitly threatened to throw Malcolm off the plane. Bail was denied. Jeannie Vance's lawyers argued she was an elderly woman with no criminal history, that her age and health made her no threat. Linda played the recording of Jeannie shooting Malcolm. Bail was denied. Shelby's lawyers had a harder argument to make. She was Emma's mother, after all. They pleaded for bail so she could see her daughter, maintain their relationship. They painted her as a victim of her parents' influence, a woman who'd been manipulated and controlled her whole life. Then Linda played the recording. "Fall like the trash you are." Shelby's voice, full of venom and laughter. Bail was denied. Malcolm watched all three Van Cess led away in handcuffs, their expensive clothes looking out of place in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the courthouse. Taylor was still blustering, making threats. Jeannie was silent, her face a mask of fury. Shelby was crying, but Malcolm felt nothing watching her tears. Those were the tears of someone who got caught, not someone who was sorry. "How do you feel?" Chris asked as they left the courthouse, pushing through a crowd of reporters. "Like I can finally breathe," Malcolm admitted. "For 3 years, I've been waiting for the other shoe to drop. Now they're the ones waiting. They're the ones in cages." But the war wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next month brought new challenges. Malcolm had to testify before the grand jury about the fraud case, detailing how he'd discovered the falsified clinical trials, the bribed officials, the covered-up deaths. He spent 6 hours answering questions, providing context for thousands of pages of evidence. The media coverage intensified. More families came forward, people whose loved ones had died because of Vance Payne. The wrongful death lawsuits multiplied. 50 cases, then 100, then 200. The Vance Industries stock price collapsed. The company itself was being dismantled, assets seized to pay future settlements. Malcolm watched the empire burn, feeling no sympathy. 317 people had died. These families deserved justice. But the Van Cess weren't going quietly. Their lawyers launched a coordinated assault on Malcolm's character. They claimed he'd seduced Shelby deliberately, married into the family to steal their wealth. They dug up his military records, trying to paint him as unstable, violent, prone to PTSD-fueled rage. They found old colleagues willing to say he'd been difficult to work with, demanding, obsessive. "It's all bullshit," Chris assured him, reviewing the opposition's filings. "They're throwing everything at the wall hoping something sticks. But you've got combat medals, commendations, a spotless record. And the employees they found will trash you? We've already discovered the Van Cess paid them off." Of course they did. Malcolm wasn't surprised. The Van Cess had operated the same way for decades. Buy what you can't intimidate what you can't buy, and destroy anything that won't cooperate. But Malcolm had allies too. Maurice Livingston wasn't the only former employee who came forward. 12 others reached out, offering testimony about how the Van Cess had systematically destroyed Malcolm's company. They provided emails, documents, records of meetings where Taylor had explicitly discussed driving Malcolm to financial ruin. "We should have spoken up before," Maurice told Malcolm when they met for coffee at a diner far from Connecticut. "We knew what they were doing to you, but we were scared. They made threats, offered bribes. Some guys took the money and stayed quiet. But watching you fight back, Malcolm, it inspired us. Made us remember we're supposed to have spines." Malcolm shook his head. "I don't blame anyone for staying quiet. The Van Cess were terrifying to go up against. They had infinite resources, infinite patience. They'd spend $1 million to destroy someone over $100 grudge, just to make a point." "Had," Maurice corrected with a grim smile. "Past tense. They're done. Their company's collapsing, their assets are frozen, and they're going to prison." "You beat them, Malcolm." "Not yet," Malcolm said. "The trials haven't even started. They could still walk." "No way. Not with the evidence you've got. Not with the Cockpit recordings." Maurice leaned forward. "But there's something else. Something you should know." "What?" "Some of us have been digging. Looking into other Vance Industries projects, other drugs they pushed. We found something bad. Real bad." Maurice pulled out a laptop, opened an encrypted file. 6 years ago, Vance Industries was developing a drug for Alzheimer's. They called it MindGuard. The early trials showed promise, but then something went wrong. Patients started having seizures, strokes. At least 15 people died during the trial. Malcolm's blood ran cold. "Why haven't I heard about this?" "Because they buried it. Deep. Paid off families, destroyed records, falsified the trial data to show the deaths were from natural causes. Then they shelved the drug and moved on to other projects." Maurice scrolled through documents. "But we found the original research notes. We found emails discussing the cover-up. Malcolm, this isn't just negligence like with Vance Payne. This is active, deliberate murder." Malcolm stared at the screen, his mind racing. If this was true, and he had no reason to doubt Maurice, Then the Van Cess crimes went far deeper than anyone knew. This wasn't just fraud. This was a pattern of killing people for profit, then erasing the evidence. Can I have copies of everything? Malcolm asked. Already done. Encrypted drive. Maurice slid it across the table. What are you going to do with it? Give it to Linda Buchanan. Give it to the FBI? Let them add it to the pile. Malcolm pocketed the drive. The Van Cess are going to die in prison, Maurice. I'm going to make absolutely sure of it. They finished their coffee in silence, both men processing the weight of what they'd discovered. 15 more victims. 15 more families who deserve justice. As Malcolm drove back to the safe house, his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered carefully. Hello. Mr. Sharp? A woman's voice, nervous, young. My name is Suzanne Shields. I'm a journalist with the Hartford Courant. I've been investigating the Vance family for 2 years. I'd like to talk to you. Malcolm's instincts went on alert. I'm not supposed to talk to press without clearing it through the prosecutor. I understand. But Mr. Sharp, I think we can help each other. I have information about the Van Cess that isn't in the public record. Things they did before you married into the family. Crimes that were covered up. I want to publish it, but I need someone to go on record. Someone with credibility. Why me? Because you're the only person who's ever successfully fought them. Everyone else who tried ended up destroyed, or dead, or disappeared. But you survived. You're still standing. And people believe you. Malcolm thought about the mine guard evidence sitting in his pocket. About 317 Vance Payne victims. About 15 mine guard victims. About how many others there might be. Crimes and murders buried so deep nobody even knew to look for them. What kind of information? He asked. Meet me in person and I'll show you. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., the public library in Middletown. Come alone. Don't tell anyone. I've been threatened by the Van Cess people before. I need to be careful. Every instinct Malcolm had screamed this was a trap. But he'd learned to evaluate risks, to calculate odds. And something in Suzanne Shields' voice sounded genuine. Scared, but genuine. I'll be there, he said. But if this is some kind of setup. It's not. I promise. She hung up before he could say anything else. Malcolm sat in his car for a long moment, thinking. Then he called Chris. I need a favor. I'm meeting someone tomorrow, a journalist who claims to have dirt on the Van Cess. I want backup, but at a distance. Someone watching to make sure it's not an ambush. You should just not go, Chris said. It smells like a trap. Probably. But if it's not, if she really does have more evidence. Chris, how many other families are out there? How many other victims we don't even know about? Silence on the line. Then, I'll have agents nearby. Plain clothes, at a distance. You wear a wire. Any sign of trouble, we move in. Thanks. Malcolm, be careful. The Van Cess have nothing left to lose. That makes them more dangerous, not less. Malcolm thought about Taylor's face in the courtroom, the rage and desperation. About Jeannie's cold calculation. About Shelby's tears that meant nothing. I know, he said, but they made me more dangerous too. He hung up and drove back to the safe house, where Emma was waiting with her toys and her innocence. She was healing, slowly, with the help of a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. She asked about her mother less now. Asked about her grandparents never. Malcolm read her a bedtime story, tucked her in, kissed her forehead. I love you, sweetheart. Love you too, Daddy. You're the best daddy ever. He watched her fall asleep, then went to his room and opened Morris's encrypted drive. The mine guard files were extensive. Clinical trial data, death reports, emails explicitly discussing covering up the deaths, names of patients, dates, locations. And then, buried in the files, something else, a list of other projects. Other drugs, other trials. Malcolm spent the night reading, his anger growing with each page. The Van Cess hadn't just been negligent. They'd been systematic. They'd treated human lives as acceptable losses in their pursuit of profit. They'd killed and covered up and killed again, over and over, for decades. By the time the sun rose, Malcolm had made a decision. He wasn't just going to put the Van Cess in prison. He was going to make sure their entire legacy burned. Every crime exposed. Every victim remembered. Every dollar of their wealth stripped away and given to the families they'd destroyed. The Van Cess had taught him to be ruthless. Now they were going to learn he'd been an excellent student. Chapter 7. The Journalist's Gift. The Middletown Public Library was busy at 2 p.m., college students studying, retirees browsing, children at story time. Malcolm scanned the reading room, spotted Suzanne Shields immediately. She was in her early 30s, dark hair pulled back, wearing jeans and a college sweatshirt. She looked up as he approached, relief crossing her face. "Mr. Sharp, thank you for coming." She had a laptop bag slung over her shoulder, clutched tight like it contained gold. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't." Malcolm sat down across from her, hyper-aware of the wire under his shirt, the FBI agents Chris had stationed around the library. "Let's skip the pleasantries. What do you have?" Suzanne opened her laptop, angled the screen away from security cameras. 3 years ago, I was assigned to write a puff piece about Vance Industries' charitable donations. Rich family gives back, that kind of thing. But while researching, I found discrepancies. Money that was supposed to go to hospitals and schools, but never arrived. Grants that were listed, but never disbursed. Embezzlement. No. Worse. She pulled up a spreadsheet. The money went to shell corporations owned by the Vances. Those corporations then paid bribes to politicians, FDA officials, medical boards. It was a money laundering operation disguised as charity. They'd donate publicly, get tax breaks and good PR, then funnel the money right back into their corruption network. Malcolm studied the numbers. Millions of dollars moving through fake charities, ending up in the pockets of people who were supposed to regulate Vance Industries. It was elegant, in a sick way. The kind of thing that would take years to untangle if anyone bothered looking. "I tried to publish this 2 years ago," Suzanne continued. "My editor killed the story. Said the Vances threatened to sue the paper into bankruptcy if we ran it. Then I started getting followed. My apartment was broken into. Nothing taken, but things moved around. Messages left. I got scared, backed off. Why come forward now? Because you prove they're not invincible. You prove they can be beaten." Her voice shook slightly. "And because I found something else. Something that made me realize I couldn't stay silent anymore." She pulled up another file. Malcolm leaned forward, reading, and felt his blood turn to ice. Jesus Christ. The document was a coroner's report from 15 years ago. Carl Stark, age 47, died of a heart attack while testifying before Congress about pharmaceutical industry practices. The report listed it as natural causes. But stapled to it was a second document, a toxicology report that had been lost and only recently resurfaced. Carl Stark had been poisoned with a substance that mimicked a heart attack. The levels in his blood were astronomical, far beyond what could occur naturally. Carl Stark was going to expose Vance Industries' fraudulent practices before Congress, Suzanne explained. His testimony would have triggered federal investigations, possibly criminal charges against Taylor Vance. Then he died suddenly, right before he could testify. Everyone assumed it was the stress. But it wasn't stress. It was murder. "How did you get this?" A source in the medical examiner's office. Someone who'd been sitting on it for 15 years, too scared to come forward. "But after seeing you survive and fight back, people are getting brave, Mr. Sharp. People are finally willing to talk." Malcolm stared at the evidence in front of him. Not just fraud, not just negligence. Actual, premeditated murder. The Vances had killed a witness to protect themselves. "There's more," Suzanne said quietly. She pulled up a list of names. 7 other people who died suddenly while investigating or opposing Vance Industries. All ruled natural causes or accidents. But the timing is too perfect. They all died right before critical moments, right before testimony, right before publication of damaging reports, right before trials. 7 people, possibly murdered, all to protect the Vances empire. "Can you prove they were murdered?" Malcolm asked. "Not definitively, but the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. And with Carl Stark's toxicology report, there's precedent. Reasonable doubt that the others were natural." She closed the laptop. "I'm publishing this story, Mr. Sharp, with or without your involvement. But I wanted you to have the information first. You're building a case against them. This could help." Malcolm nodded slowly. "I need copies of everything. Already prepared." She handed him a USB drive. "Encrypted. Password is your daughter's birthday. I figured you'd remember that." "How do you know my daughter's birthday?" Suzanne smiled sadly. "I've been researching your family for a year, Mr. Sharp. I know a lot about you. I know you were a good father even when the Vances treated you like garbage. I know you built a company from nothing and they destroyed it out of spite. I know you're the only decent person in that whole toxic family." She paused. "I also know you recorded everything, that you planned this for years. Some people are calling you manipulative for that. I call it smart. Some people would call it obsessive. Some people have never been trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. Suzanne stood to leave. My story publishes tomorrow. There'll be fallout. The Van Cess lawyers will attack me, probably sue. But I'm done being scared of them. If you could survive being thrown off a plane, I can survive a lawsuit. She left before Malcolm could respond, disappearing into the library stacks like a ghost. Malcolm sat alone with the USB drive, processing what he'd learned. 7 possible murders. Dozens of drug deaths. Hundreds of destroyed lives. The Van Cess weren't just criminals. They were monsters. Malcolm left the library, nodded to the FBI agents watching from a distance, and drove back to the safe house. But instead of going inside, he sat in the car and called Linda Buchanan. I have new evidence, he said when she answered. Multiple murders. Witness tampering via murder. A toxicology report that proves Carl Stark was poisoned. Silence on the line. Then, send me everything. I'll review it tonight. If it's legitimate, this changes the entire case. We're not just talking fraud and attempted murder anymore. We're talking capital charges. Connecticut doesn't have the death penalty. Federal murder charges do. If the Van Cess killed Carl Stark to prevent his congressional testimony, that's federal witness tampering resulting in death. That's life without parole at minimum, possible death penalty. Linda's voice was hard. Send me the evidence, Malcolm. Let me do my job. Malcolm forwarded the encrypted files, then sat in the darkness, thinking. 3 years ago, he'd married into what he thought was a successful, if cold, family. He'd thought the worst of them was snobbery and cruelty. He'd had no idea he was marrying into a crime family that would make the mafia proud. His phone buzzed. A text from Chris. Everything okay? You've been sitting in your car for 20 minutes. Malcolm typed back, just thinking. I'm fine. Going inside now. But he wasn't fine. He was realizing that no matter how much evidence he gathered, no matter how many crimes he exposed, he'd never fully understand the depths of the Van Cess depravity. There would always be more victims, more crimes, more bodies buried in their past. And that meant he could never stop fighting, could never rest. Not until every last secret was exposed and every last crime was punished. Malcolm finally went inside, checked on Emma, sleeping peacefully, thank God, and sat down at his computer. The encrypted files Suzanne had given him were extensive. Years of research, dozens of suspicious deaths, a paper trail that suggested the Van Cess had been killing people who threatened them for at least 2 decades. He started copying files, organizing them, preparing to send them to every relevant authority. FBI, state police, congressional oversight committees, pharmaceutical regulatory boards. The Van Cess had built their empire on corpses. Malcolm was going to make sure everyone knew it. Around midnight, his phone rang. Unknown number again. Malcolm answered warily. Hello. You son of a bitch. Taylor Vance's voice, calling from prison. Inmates had access to phones. You think you've won? You think destroying my company means anything? Taylor, calling me from prison. How's the jumpsuit fitting? Fuck you, Malcolm. You were nothing when Shelby met you. Nothing but a grunt with delusions of grandeur. We made you. We gave you access to our world. And you betrayed us. You tried to throw me off a plane. You deserved it. Taylor's voice rose, losing control. You were never good enough for my daughter. Never good enough for this family. You should have signed the papers, taken the money, and disappeared like a good little peasant. Instead, I gathered evidence of your crimes and had you arrested. Yeah, I'm funny that way. You think the evidence matters? You think I won't walk? I've got the best lawyers money can buy. I've got judges in my pocket. I've got a toxicology report showing you poisoned Carl Stark 15 years ago, Malcolm interrupted. I've got evidence of 7 other suspicious deaths. I've got your money laundering scheme through fake charities. I've got MindGuard and the 15 people who died that you covered up. And I've got recordings of you threatening to kill me. Taylor, you're never getting out of prison. You're going to die there, forgotten and despised. And I'm going to make sure Emma never even remembers your name. Silence. Then, you can't keep my granddaughter from me. I have rights. You have nothing. You're a convicted criminal awaiting trial on multiple murder charges. You'll never see Emma again. She's safe from you. Finally, Malcolm hung up before Taylor could respond. Let the old man rage impotently in his cell. Let him realize, slowly, that his empire was truly gone, that his power was broken, that Malcolm Sharp had beaten him completely. The next morning, Suzanne Shields' article published. The Vance Body Count. How a Pharmaceutical Empire Was Built on Murder screamed the headline. The Hartford Courant put it on the front page. By noon, it had been picked up by the Associated Press. By evening, it was national news. Malcolm watched the coverage with grim satisfaction. Every major outlet was now covering not just the Vance Payne fraud, but the possible murders, the suspicious deaths, the decades-long pattern of eliminating threats. Public opinion, which had already been against the Vances, turned into outright hatred. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse. Victims' families held vigils. Politicians who'd taken Vance money scrambled to distance themselves. The empire wasn't just falling. It was being torn apart by an angry mob. And Malcolm Sharp stood at the center of it all, the man who'd brought everything crashing down. But he wasn't done yet. Chapter 8. The Trial. For months later, Malcolm sat in the front row of a federal courtroom as the trial of Taylor and Jeannie Vance finally began. Shelby's trial would come later. Her lawyers had managed to get her case separated, hoping public outrage would die down before she faced a jury. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, victims' families, law students, and curious onlookers filled every seat. Federal marshals lined the walls, maintaining order. Taylor and Jeannie Vance sat at the defense table, flanked by a team of expensive lawyers. They'd aged in the months since their arrest. Taylor's face was gaunt, his hair fully white now. Jeannie's perfect facade had cracked, showing the brittle fury underneath. Linda Buchanan stood to give her opening statement. She was magnificent, commanding, precise, devastating. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the next weeks, you will hear a story of greed, corruption, and murder on a scale that will shock you. The defendants, Taylor and Jeannie Vance, were not just pharmaceutical executives who made mistakes. They were architects of a criminal conspiracy that killed over 300 people and destroyed countless lives. She walked the jury through the evidence, the falsified clinical trials, the bribed officials, the covered-up deaths. Then she moved to the attempted murder charges. On March 15th of this year, Malcolm Sharp and his 4-year-old daughter Emma were aboard the Vance family's private jet. The defendants, along with their daughter Shelby Vance, attempted to murder Mr. Sharp by forcing him off the aircraft at 30,000 feet. They failed only because Mr. Sharp, a former Marine, used his training and quick thinking to save himself and his daughter using emergency equipment. We have cockpit voice recordings of these events. We have physical evidence from the aircraft. And we have the testimony of the pilot, who witnessed everything. Linda played the cockpit recording. The courtroom fell silent as Taylor's voice filled the air. Sign the goddamn papers, or you're going to have a very unfortunate accident. Then Jeannie's voice. Nobody will find you at 30,000 feet. And finally, Shelby's laugh. Fall like the trash you are. Several jurors looked physically ill. One woman was crying. The defense attorneys tried to recover in their opening statement, painting Malcolm as a manipulative opportunist who'd seduced Shelby for her money, then turned on the family when he didn't get what he wanted. They claimed the plane incident was a misunderstanding, that Malcolm had overreacted to a business discussion and endangered his own daughter. But their argument fell apart when Linda called her first witness, Hal Ward, the pilot. Ward testified for 3 hours, describing how Taylor had given him unusual instructions before the flight, how he'd been told to disable certain safety protocols, how he'd witnessed the confrontation in the cabin. His voice shook as he described hearing the gunshot, the alarms, Malcolm's desperate escape. Did you believe Mr. Sharp and his daughter were in danger? Linda asked. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. I've flown for the Vances for 15 years. I've seen them be cold, be cruel. But that day I saw them try to commit murder. The defense tried to shake him on cross-examination, suggesting he was testifying against his former employers for immunity or money. But Ward held firm. I'm testifying because it's the right thing to do. I should have spoken up years ago about things I saw, things I knew were wrong. But I was scared. I was a coward. Not anymore. Day after day, the prosecution built their case. Former Vance Industries employees testified about the fraud, about being ordered to falsify data, about knowing people were dying and being told to stay quiet. Victims' family members took the stand, describing loved ones who'd become addicted to Vance Payne, who'd died from overdoses or complications. Malcolm testified on day 12. He spent 6 hours on the stand, calmly walking the jury through his 3 years of gathering evidence. He showed them documents, played recordings, explained how he'd discovered each piece of the puzzle. The defense attorneys tried to rattle him, suggesting his evidence was manufactured, that he'd set up the Van Cess from the beginning. Mr. Sharp, isn't it true you married Shelby Vance specifically to gain access to her family's wealth? No, Malcolm said calmly. I married Shelby because I loved her. Or I loved who I thought she was. And when that didn't work out, you decided to destroy the family? No, I decided to document their crimes and protect my daughter. If the family got destroyed in the process, that was their own doing. Convenient. Is it convenient that 317 people died because of Vance pain? Is it convenient that the Van Cess tried to throw me off a plane? Is it convenient that we have recordings of all of it? Malcolm's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath. I didn't destroy the Vance family. They destroyed themselves. I just made sure everyone knew about it. The defense had no response to that. The trial lasted 7 weeks. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Taylor Vance showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but his hands trembled. Jeannie Vance's face twisted with rage and disbelief. In the gallery, victims' families wept with relief. Malcolm sat still, feeling a weight he'd carried for years finally lift. It wasn't over. Shelby still faced trial. There would be appeals. The civil suits would drag on for years. But this was the key victory. The cornerstone. The Van Cess had been found guilty by a jury of ordinary people who'd heard the evidence and said, "This is wrong. This is criminal. This deserves punishment." At sentencing 3 weeks later, Taylor Vance received 247 years in federal prison. Jeannie Vance received 189 years. They would die in prison, no possibility of parole. As marshals led them away, Taylor turned and looked at Malcolm one last time. His expression was pure hatred. Malcolm looked back calmly. He'd won. Completely, utterly, definitively. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Malcolm. He'd prepared a statement, worked on it with Linda Buchanan to make sure he said everything that needed saying. I want to thank the jury for their service and their courage. I want to thank the prosecutors, the FBI, the police, and everyone who helped bring justice. But most of all, I want to acknowledge the victims, the 317 people who died because of Vance pain, the 15 who died during Mindguard trials, and all the others whose lives were destroyed by the Vance family's greed. Malcolm paused, gathering his thoughts. I didn't do this for revenge. I did it for my daughter, so she could grow up in a world where the powerful can't destroy people without consequences. I did it because someone had to stand up and say, enough. No more deaths, no more lies, no more corruption. Today, justice was served. Today, the victims were heard. And today, I can finally tell my daughter that the bad people who tried to hurt us will never hurt anyone again. He walked away without taking questions, Chris Wilkinson providing escort through the crowd. Emma was waiting at the safe house with her nanny, and Malcolm needed to see her, to hold her, to remind himself why he'd fought so hard. That evening, Malcolm and Emma sat together in their small apartment, eating pizza and watching a Disney movie. Emma didn't understand everything that had happened, but she understood enough. They were safe now. The people who'd been scary were gone. Daddy? She asked during a quiet moment in the movie. Can we get a dog? Malcolm laughed, his first genuine, unguarded laugh in months. Yes, sweetheart. We can get a dog. We can get whatever you want. I want a big dog. To protect us. We don't need protection anymore, baby girl. But we can still get a big dog. And a house? With a yard? And a house with a yard. Emma smiled, satisfied, and turned back to the movie. Malcolm watched her, feeling something like peace settle over him. The trials weren't completely over. Shelby's case was still pending. But Malcolm had done what he set out to do. He'd protected his daughter. He'd exposed the truth. He'd brought down an empire built on death and corruption. His phone buzzed. A message from Maurice Livingston. 12 of us from the old company are ready to rebuild whenever you are. We believe in you, Malcolm. Let's show those bastards what you can really do when they're not sabotaging you. Malcolm smiled and typed back. Give me 6 months to get Emma settled. Then we start fresh. Better than before. He'd been broken down, rebuilt, tested in fire. The man who'd married Shelby Vance 3 years ago was gone, destroyed in the same flames that had consumed the Vance empire. But from those ashes, something stronger had emerged. A father who'd do anything to protect his child. A fighter who refused to quit. A man who'd learned that sometimes the only way to beat monsters is to become someone they can't destroy. Malcolm Sharp had gone to war with billionaires and won. Now he was going to show them what he could build in peace. Chapter 9. Rise from the Ashes. 6 months after the Vance convictions, Malcolm stood in the lobby of Sharp Security Solutions, breathing in the smell of new carpet and fresh paint. The office building was modest, nothing like the space he'd had before the Vances destroyed his first company. But it was his, bought with money he'd carefully hidden during his years trapped in the Vance estate. "Looks good, boss." Maurice Livingston appeared beside him, holding a tablet showing employee schedules. "We've got 15 people starting Monday, all from the old crew, plus 3 new hires. Everyone's excited to be back." Malcolm nodded, feeling something settle in his chest. Not quite peace. There was still too much anger, too much trauma for true peace. But purpose, direction, a future that wasn't defined by the Vances. "How's the contract pipeline?" "Strong. Really strong." Maurice pulled up a spreadsheet. "Turns out, being the guy who took down a corrupt pharmaceutical empire is great for business. Everyone wants to hire the security consultant who's famous for exposing corporate fraud. We've got 6 major clients lined up, 3 more in negotiations. We'll be profitable within a year at this rate." Malcolm allowed himself a small smile. He'd rebuilt before, but doing it a second time felt different. He knew the pitfalls now, knew who to trust and who to avoid, knew how to protect what he was building. "What about the other thing?" Malcolm asked quietly. Morris's expression grew serious. "The foundation is set up. Sharp Justice Foundation, 501c3, status approved. We've got seed money from the settlement." That was the other development. After the Vance Industries assets were liquidated, Malcolm had been named lead plaintiff in the civil suit representing Vance pain victims. The settlement had been massive, $4.7 billion distributed among the families. Malcolm had received $50 million for the attempted murder and the destruction of his company. He'd put $40 million of it into the Sharp Justice Foundation. The foundation will provide legal assistance to people who can't afford to fight corporate corruption, Malcolm explained to Maurice. "Free lawyers, investigators, resources. Everything I had to build myself, will give to others." That's really something, Malcolm. It's what should have existed before. Maybe if it had, the Vances would have been stopped years ago. Malcolm turned away from the window. "How's Emma?" "Happy. I saw her yesterday. She's still excited about starting kindergarten in the fall." Malcolm and Emma had moved into a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood 40 minutes from Hartford. It had a yard, a tree house, and enough space for the German Shepherd puppy Emma had named Thunder. They'd spent the last 6 months healing together, therapy for both of them, building routines, creating a life that had nothing to do with the Vances. Emma was thriving. The nightmares had stopped. She smiled easily, laughed often, was making friends with neighborhood kids. She rarely mentioned her mother and never asked about her grandparents. Malcolm's phone buzzed. A news alert. Shelby Vance trial begins today. Right. He'd almost forgotten, too busy building his new life to pay attention to the last piece of the Vance saga. Shelby's trial had been delayed multiple times, her lawyers trying every possible tactic. But today, finally, she'd face a jury for her role in the attempted murder, the fraud conspiracy, and the cover-up of Vance Payne deaths. "You going to watch?" Maurice asked. "No." Malcolm pocketed his phone. "I testified at the grand jury. Gave my deposition. That's enough. I don't need to see her convicted to know it's going to happen." The prosecutors seemed confident. They have the recordings. They have the evidence. Shelby made her choices. She chose her family's money over everything else. Now she pays for it. Malcolm meant it. He felt nothing watching Shelby face justice. No satisfaction, no anger, nothing. She was irrelevant now. A chapter closed. His phone rang. Chris Wilkinson's number. Malcolm answered. "Chris." "Malcolm, I wanted to give you a heads up. Shelby's lawyers just filed a motion to allow her access to Emma during the trial. They're claiming maternal rights, saying a child needs her mother, the usual bullshit." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "No, it's not going to be granted. The judge already denied 3 similar motions. But I wanted you to know they're still trying. Emma's healing, Chris. She's happy. She doesn't need Shelby's toxicity in her life." Malcolm took a breath, controlling his anger. "Tell the judge I'll fight this to the Supreme Court if necessary." Shelby lost her parental rights when she tried to kill her child's father. End of discussion. I'll pass that along. But Malcolm, realistically, they're just throwing spaghetti at the wall. They know they're going to lose the criminal case, so they're trying to create sympathy, paint Shelby as a loving mother separated from her child. She's not a loving mother. She's a criminal who chose greed over her own daughter. I know. The jury will know too. Chris paused. How are you doing? Really? Malcolm looked around the new office, thought about Emma waiting at home, about the future he was building. I'm good. Better than I've been in years. The Van Cess tried to destroy me, and instead I'm stronger than before. My company's back and better. Emma's safe and happy, and they're rotting in prison where they belong. You earned it all, Malcolm. Every bit of it. After hanging up, Malcolm spent the rest of the day working on contracts, reviewing security proposals, building his business. He was good at this, had always been good at it. The Van Cess had taken it away temporarily, but they hadn't destroyed his skills or his reputation. If anything, they'd made him famous. The man who brought down the Van Cess had a certain ring to it. At 6 p.m., Malcolm drove home. Emma burst out the front door as he pulled up, Thunder the German shepherd bounding beside her. Daddy, Daddy. Thunder learned a new trick. Malcolm spent the evening watching his daughter train her dog, helping with homework, making dinner. Normal, domestic, peaceful things that he'd once taken for granted. Now he treasured every moment. After Emma was asleep, Malcolm sat on the back porch with a beer, watching fireflies dance across the yard. His phone showed news updates about Shelby's trial. Opening statements had been dramatic, apparently. The prosecution had played the Cockpit recordings again. Shelby had cried on camera, claiming she'd been coerced. Malcolm didn't believe her for a second. Neither would the jury. 3 weeks later, the verdict came in. Shelby Vance, guilty on all counts. Sentencing was set for a month later. Malcolm read the news while drinking his morning coffee, felt a momentary satisfaction, then moved on with his day. He had a meeting with a major client, then Emma's school play that evening, then dinner with Maurice and some of the old crew. The Van Cess no longer defined his life. They were just criminals he'd helped put in prison, relevant only as cautionary tales. At Shelby's sentencing, Malcolm did attend. Not for closure, he'd found that already, but because he wanted Shelby to see him, to see what he'd become while she'd been rotting in prison awaiting trial. He wore an expensive suit, custom-tailored. Looked healthy, strong, successful. He sat in the gallery with Emma's picture in his pocket, a reminder of what he'd protected. Shelby was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, her hair pulled back severely, no makeup. She'd lost weight, looked haggard. Her eyes found Malcolm immediately. He stared back calmly. No hatred, no triumph. Just nothing. She was nothing to him now. The judge sentenced her to 47 years in federal prison. She'd be 75 when she got out, if she got out. With good behavior, maybe parole at 65. Maybe. Either way, Emma would be grown. Would have had a childhood free from Shelby's influence. Would remember Malcolm as her father and protector, while Shelby faded into a distant, unpleasant memory. As marshals led Shelby away, she tried to speak to Malcolm. Please, just let me see Emma once. Please, no, Malcolm said simply. Then he walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Outside, reporters swarmed him. Malcolm had prepared another statement. Today's sentencing closes a chapter on one of the darkest periods of my life. Shelby Vance, like her parents, made choices that destroyed lives. She chose greed over family, cruelty over compassion, corruption over integrity. She will now face the consequences of those choices. As for me and my daughter, we're moving forward. We're building a new life, a good life, filled with love and hope and integrity. The Van Cess tried to destroy us. Instead, they destroyed themselves. That's the real lesson here. Evil doesn't win. It may prosper for a while, but eventually, it falls. And when it does, the people it tried to destroy rise from the ashes, stronger than before. Malcolm walked away without taking questions, got in his car, and drove to Emma's school to pick her up. Daddy, she ran to him, backpack bouncing. We made art today. Look, she held up a painting, stick figures of her and Malcolm and Thunder, standing in front of a house with a huge sun overhead. It's beautiful, sweetheart. I'm going to put it on my wall at home. Our home. Our home. Not the Vance estate, not a safe house, not temporary housing. Their home, that they'd chosen together, that was filled with love instead of cruelty. Malcolm drove them to get ice cream, then to the park where Emma played while Thunder chased squirrels. Normal things. Happy things. That night, after Emma was asleep, Malcolm sat at his desk and wrote a letter. Not to the Vances, they deserved nothing from him, but to the Vance Payne victims' families, the Mindguard families, everyone who'd suffered because of the Vances greed. I'm sorry, he wrote. I'm sorry I didn't discover their crimes earlier. I'm sorry I married into that family and gave them credibility. I'm sorry for every day I stayed silent while people died. I can't bring back your loved ones. I can't undo the damage. But I promise you this. The Sharp Justice Foundation will fight so this never happens again. We'll help people expose corporate corruption. We'll give voice to the voiceless. We'll make sure the next Malcolm Sharp doesn't have to fight alone for 3 years before getting justice. Your loved ones didn't die in vain. Their deaths exposed evil that had been hidden for decades. And that evil has been destroyed. Malcolm sealed the letter. He'd send copies to every family tomorrow, and sat back, feeling something close to peace. The war was over. He'd won, not just by putting the Vances in prison, but by refusing to let them break him, by protecting Emma, by rebuilding what they destroyed, by turning pain into purpose. Malcolm Sharp had gone to war with billionaires and won. But more importantly, he'd learned that winning wasn't about revenge. It was about surviving, healing, and building something better from the ruins. He'd taught Emma that monsters could be beaten, and he'd taught himself that sometimes the best revenge was living well. The Vances would spend the rest of their lives in prison, forgotten and despised. Malcolm would spend the rest of his life free, successful, and loved. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Epilogue. 5 years later, Malcolm stood in a congressional hearing room, testifying before the Senate Subcommittee on Pharmaceutical Oversight. Emma, now 9 years old, sat in the gallery with Chris Wilkinson, watching her father with pride. Mr. Sharp, the committee chairman said, your foundation has helped expose 17 major cases of pharmaceutical fraud in the past 5 years. You've recovered billions in damages for victims and sent dozens of corrupt executives to prison. What drives you? Malcolm thought about it, then answered honestly. I remember what it felt like to be powerless. To know something was wrong, but not have the resources to fight back. I remember being told I was nothing, that I didn't matter, that powerful people could destroy me without consequences. He paused. The Sharp Justice Foundation exists so nobody else has to feel that way. So the next person who discovers corruption has somewhere to turn. So David actually beats Goliath sometimes. The committee members nodded. One senator spoke up. We're considering legislation that would provide federal funding for organizations like yours to help expose corporate fraud. Would the Sharp Justice Foundation accept such funding? Absolutely. Every dollar we get goes toward helping people who can't fight for themselves. Malcolm smiled slightly. The Vances taught me that money is power. I'm making sure that power gets used for good instead of evil. After the hearing, Malcolm and Emma walked through the Capitol building. Thunder, now a trained therapy dog, trotting beside them on his leash. Did you really beat bad guys, Daddy? Emma asked. She knew the story in age-appropriate terms, knew her father was a hero who'd helped a lot of people. I helped good people beat bad guys, Malcolm corrected. It's always a team effort. When I grow up, I want to help people too. Malcolm looked down at his daughter, strong, smart, kind despite everything she'd been through. You already do, sweetheart. Just by being you. That night, Malcolm's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Hello. Malcolm Sharp? An old voice, shaking slightly. Yes. My name is Roland Neff. My daughter. She died 3 years ago from a drug called NeuroBoost. The company said it was safe, but it killed her. They covered it up. I tried to fight them alone, but I couldn't. The man's voice broke. Then I saw your story. About the Vances, about how you fought them. And I thought, maybe you could help. Malcolm listened to Roland Neff's story, his heart breaking for this father who'd lost his daughter the same way so many had lost loved ones to the Vances. Mr. Neff, Malcolm said quietly, I'm going to connect you with the Sharp Justice Foundation tomorrow. We're going to investigate. If NeuroBoost killed your daughter because of corporate negligence or fraud, we're going to expose it. And we're going to make them pay. Thank you, the old man whispered. Thank you. After hanging up, Malcolm sat in the darkness for a moment. Then he smiled grimly. The war with the Vances was over. But the bigger war, The one against corruption, greed, and powerful people who thought they were above the law. That war would never end. Malcolm Sharp had learned how to fight it, and he'd spend the rest of his life making sure nobody had to fight alone. The Vances had tried to destroy him. Instead, they'd created their worst nightmare. Someone who knew all their tactics, who'd learned from their cruelty, who had the resources and determination to stop others like them. In the end, the best revenge wasn't destroying your enemies. It was becoming someone who made sure they could never hurt anyone again. Malcolm Sharp had done exactly that, and he was just getting started. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.